Well, now we come to the next event, and this time it is the next event, I believe. I can't see any obvious connection between this one and the last one, so I think that we've now moved on. Jesus is approaching a town, and something strange happens. Soon afterwards, verse 11 to 17 in chapter 7 of Luke. Soon afterward, so after this incident of the century, soon afterward, Jesus went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went along with him. And as he approached the town gate, a dead person was being carried out. And she was a widow. A large crowd from the town was with her, and when the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her. Some versions say he had compassion on her. And he said, "Don't cry." And then he went up and he touched the bier that they were carrying him on. The bearers stood still, and he said, "Young man, I say to you, get up." And the dead man sat up and began to talk, and Jesus gave him back to his mother, and they were all filled with awe. And they praised God. "A great prophet has appeared among us," they said. "God has come to help his people." And this news about Jesus spread throughout Judea and the surrounding country. I heard about a young pastor who was doing his first sermon at a funeral, and he was very concerned about what to say. It's one of those events in a pastor's life that, especially your first funeral, is fear and trepidation. How do you minister in this setting? What do you say? Well, this young pastor thought, I'm going to read through the New Testament. I'm going to find those places where Jesus was at funerals and find out what he said, and then I'll say what Jesus said, because that seems like a pretty good tactic. Well, after searching through the New Testament, he discovered that this might not be the easiest course of action. See, it seems that every time that Jesus went to a funeral, there's something that happened. Jesus raised the guy from the dead. He didn't preach any sermons. He just talked to the person who was dead and said, "Come on back." And he raised them from the dead. Well, this is one of those funerals. Jesus wasn't on the invite list. He just happened to be coming into the city gates as the funeral procession was coming out. And I think you would agree with me that things don't just happen for Jesus. Jesus knows, and God plans, and there's nothing that's happenstance about this. Jesus comes into the city at the appropriate time, at the perfect time, when God ordains that he should be coming in. And this funeral procession is just on its way out. And we know that the dead man was the only son of a widow. Now, we don't know if Jesus knew that beforehand or if Luke just wrote that because he found that out later. But that set of facts is hugely important as we look at what Jesus does here. It's hugely important. See, in Israel at the time, they didn't have stocks and bonds. They didn't have mutual funds. They didn't have retirement investment portfolios. The only thing they had for retirement? Children. That was their investment certificate. And we're told that this is an only son. So that means there's no other alternatives for retirement other than perhaps begging. And then we're told another piece of information that even complicates things more. Not only was he an only son, but his mother was a widow. She'd already lost her husband. See, in Israel at that time, there are no safety nets. There's no old age security. There's no Canada pension plan. And so this woman is destined for the poorhouse. She had nothing. And now her only son, her only hope for provision is gone. She can't even go to a law court and get anything done because it's the men that have to go. That's their culture. And so as she's leaving the city gates to bury her only son, the crowd from the town is mourning her. Jesus approaches the gate with a large crowd following him. And having seen her, the Lord was moved with compassion. The Lord was, his heart went out to her, is what one of the versions says. But the Greek word that's used here is something that's much deeper. I don't know if you've ever experienced a deep loss. we would say that our heart's broken because there's this pain, but from personal experience, the pain isn't here. The pain it's deeper. It's all of your innards are just, and that's the word that's used when it says Jesus was moved with compassion. His innards, the Greek word is splanchnoi. He was moved inside because Jesus came face to face with death. While Jesus didn't preach at funerals, we are told that Jesus wept. At the funeral of Lazarus, Jesus wept. In this funeral, he was filled with compassion. And you could easily make an argument that even at this funeral, Jesus may have wept. It would lead us to ask a question about Jesus' perspective on death and funerals. How did Jesus view death? Death, I believe, in Jesus' point of view, there was no greater symbol of the work that the evil one accomplished. Death was the result of sin. Death is the natural consequence of disobedience to God. Romans 6:23, for the wages of sin is death. When God's talking to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, on the day that you eat of it, that fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, on the day that you eat of it, you will surely die. Death was required to cover the original sin in that Garden of Eden. God killed an animal to make skins to cover Adam and Eve's nakedness. Animals had to die in the place of the one who committed the sin. That was the whole law of Moses. They would bring their sacrifices to the temple. And yet Jesus knew that these deaths of the animals, they were just temporary. There would be another death that wouldn't just cover sin, but would pay the penalty in full. And Jesus knew whose death that would be. He knew that it would be his death. He knew that he would very shortly have to hang on that tree and receive the curses for the sin of mankind. Jesus knew that death was a separation. It was a separation of this young man from his mother. Death was a separation of sinners from their Creator. And death would be a separation between the members of the Godhood when Jesus would cry out on that day, my God, why have you forsaken me? And so Jesus had compassion on this woman. Jesus' heart was broken by death. And Jesus felt it at the very depth of his being, in the pit of his stomach. He didn't just relate to her pain. His core was shaken. He was filled with compassion. And when the Son of God is filled with compassion, you can expect something amazing to happen. And from the outside, it seems at first glance that there's some really improper things that are going along here. Jesus looks at the mother and says, don't weep. What do you mean? She's at a funeral. This is her only son. Don't weep. But he's not giving her a command. He's showing love. He's communicating, don't weep. It's going to be okay. Just wait. Just watch. It's going to be okay. He says, don't weep. That's what you do, though, at the death of your son. You weep. You let all your emotions come out with no thought about what others might think. You sob, you wail, you weep. And Jesus basically says, I understand, but it's okay. You can stop now. You can wait just a moment and you're going to receive comfort. And if there was a tie-in to the sermon that Jesus preached, it was, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. And she's about to receive her comfort. Jesus went to the little cot, or however the bier that they're holding the body on, probably two poles with a cloth on it. And the body would have probably been covered with a shroud and had been wrapped in strips of cloth. Interesting. That's what they did.
that's really significant in Christmas story. Swan and clothes and the streets of blood. So I would go for sharing. Carrying the stood still. Those come. He was just mystifying and dresses. All the still creation is moving.
Young man, get up. And if there was only a second in between the command and the response, it must have been the longest second in that mother's life. Could this really be happening? Could it be true that this rabbi has the authority to call the dead back to life? Well, any speculation that she might have had was quickly resolved as the sheets moved. And the young man sat up and he started to make some sounds from under all those layers of cloth. And Jesus gave this young man back to his mother. Their conclusion was that they were filled with awe. Really, the literal translation says, fear seized them. And rightly so. Who is this man who has power over life and death? Who is this man who can speak to the dead and they come back to life? Well, they concluded that a great prophet had appeared among them. And their conclusion was going in the right direction. It just didn't go quite far enough. This wasn't just a prophet. This was Emmanuel, God with them. He was the creator. He was their God. And he had come not just to raise this young man, but to put an end to death once and for all. And he had come because that splanchnoy, that compassion in the pit of his stomach, that same compassion that he had for that widow is the same compassion that he has for the world. It was that same compassion that would see him hang on the cross in our stead. It was that same compassion that would take the punishment that should have been ours and bear it himself. Isaiah says the punishment that brought us peace was upon him. It's interesting because Jesus didn't negotiate with this woman. He didn't explain who he was, what he wanted to do. He just stepped in and he acted. And he made a decision that only he could make. But when it comes to the offer for us, there is a decision. See, Jesus doesn't force his compassion on us. He asks us to make a choice. We're told, but as many as received him, to those who believed in his name, there's choice in receiving and believing, to them he gave the right to be called the sons of God. And so this morning we're going to come and we're going to celebrate communion now. And as we celebrate communion, we need to realize that this is our choice. We need to realize that in taking the bread and the cup, that these are a reenactment of what Jesus shared with his disciples on the night before his death. And we need to realize that in our act of taking these symbols, it is an act of commitment. It is an act of saying yes to Jesus. It's like affixing our signature again to a covenant that binds us to Jesus. It's an act of saying, Jesus, you have my heart. You have my life. You have all of me. And I seal that once again by taking these symbols. So if you're at home, go and grab some bread, a glass with some juice or whatever's appropriate. And we're going to participate in this act together in just a moment.